It's hard to be the truth in this age of misinformation. No place is safe and mistakes are flagrant. No knowledge of physics, no faith in cadence. The awake's forsaken, the saints complacent. What's ancient ain't shit like pics and profiles. No child left behind, how we face it?
He holds a Ph.D. with distinction from the University of Pennsylvania, and as I mentioned, his research work has really helped to inform our knowledge and capability in the intersection between culture, politics, and education. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you an amazing professor, from what I understand, a good friend, and an accomplished scholar, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
First of all, thank you for that generous introduction. I'm honored and moved to be invited to UConn to celebrate this day with you. Can we give a round of applause also to Dr. Price? Dr. Price is the heart and soul of this institution. She is the spirit of this place, and whenever I come back, I'm always reminded of just how integral she is to this place, not just as a leader, as an intellect, but also as a guiding spirit to make this place, which can just be a bunch of buildings and bureaucracies and institutions, actually feel like a home to so many of us. Also, thank you to all of the people who performed. When I heard this little light of mine, it warmed my heart. When I saw those praise dancers, I hadn't quite seen a performance like that before, and I was excited to be a part of it. Today is special. Today is special because we are honoring the life and the legacy of Martin King. So many people give lip service to the idea of celebrating King. So many people give lip service to the most superficial dimensions of his legacy and life, but few people take the time to take Dr. King seriously. And part of what it means to take Dr. King seriously is to commit institutionally to his life, to his ideas, to this notion of service that just preceded me. So the fact that the school itself is willing to have a site this big and to have so many of you come out, not just to hear me run my mouth, but to engage in forms of service all day, all week, to talk about tough issues. Y'all are operating in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. I'm grateful to you all for that. So, what does it mean to operate in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr.? That, for me, is what we need to talk about today. What does it mean to operate in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. in 2017? 4 days before inauguration. Man, no. I said execution, y'all like, oh. What does it mean to think about Martin King as you sit at the University of Connecticut? What does it mean to think about Martin Luther King Jr. against the backdrop of a world that is more and more complicated, more and more dangerous for some, less and less free for others? How can we wrestle with this legacy in a way that does Dr. King well? See, too often we think about Dr. King's legacy as one of completion, one of celebration. We came, we marched, we won. And if you think about Martin King, through the lens of completion, then you believe that our democracy is finished. You believe that the work that has been done is as good as it could possibly be. You believe that all of the struggles, all of the sacrifices, all of the bloodshed, all of the tears, that have all been worthwhile, but they've all been cashed in as fully as humanly possible. And I'm saying, no, that's not the legacy of King. It's tough to think about the legacy of King during the presidency of Obama. Because the legacy of Obama can seduce us into believing that our democracy is finished. That this American democratic experiment has done all the work that it can do. On November 4th, 2008, when Barack Obama becomes president, many of us felt as if we were literally completing the legacy of King. That America had overcome. And in some ways we had. When Barack Obama becomes president, he's doing so just a few hundred years past Jamestown. 1619 black folk came here as property. And for the next several hundred years, African people in this strange place called America picked cotton. We created the industry, and we were the energizing force that created American capitalism, that created the American empire. Black folk created America through unpaid labor. This is part of the truth of America. And that unpaid labor turned into a particular type of experiment in democracy, one that we were on the outside of. So, to see Barack Obama president feels like an extraordinary thing. We just a few hundred years past, actually we just 145 years past the Emancipation Proclamation when Barack Obama becomes president. Right. We just a few decades beyond barking dogs and water hoses, segregated lunch counters, fighting to integrate old myths, struggling to operate in the South without your money being counterfeit. You can't buy a hamburger with the money you worked for. You can't sit at a Woolworth lunch counter. You can't go to Horton Harder. You can't buy a Coca-Cola. You can't have my dad born 1928, his high school class went to the Washington Monument and couldn't have its picture taken in front of it. The dogs could. We're in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act happens, 43 years after black folk fully and finally have access to American citizenship in any real fashion. When we finally get the franchise and we can finally vote, those same hands that picked cotton started picking presidents. And 45 years later, one of our own children becomes the leader of the most powerful empire in human history. And it does make you feel good. It does make you feel inspired. It does make you believe that we live in a nation that doesn't just grow old, but also grows up. And that can seduce you into believing that King's legacy is complete. That we may have elected a person because of the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, and we can become seduced into that Disney-fied narrative of multiculturalism that governs and overdetermines the way in which we understand American democracy. But King's legacy cries from the grave and says, we gotta do more. King's legacy would not be satisfied with November 4th, 2008 or November 6th, 2012. King's legacy would be intrigued by a Negro in the White House. But I believe King's legacy would be much more concerned with those who are living outdoors. Much more concerned with those who are homeless. King's legacy would remind us that there have always been black elites. There have always been black politicians. There have always been black moneymakers. And the fact that we have a few more now that we got a Tyler Perry making movies. See, that's what y'all should have grown for. We got Oprah with her own network, or Ken Chenault running American Express, or we have an expansion of black Ph.D.s and MBAs. That all of this stuff is good, but that our nation, our democratic experiment is only as good as the least of these. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad said, no man or woman can rise above the condition of their people. What does it mean for us to struggle in 2017 with mass unemployment, with mass incarceration, with broken education, with food insecurity, with universities that are becoming less like bastions of democracy and more like multinational corporations, with technocratic rationalities, presidents that are more like CEOs, tenure being exploited and eliminated, casualizing labor, graduate students being exploited, being made to teach more and more for less and less, adjuncts being used instead of full-time faculty, unions being broken, everyday workers in the university being paid less than a living wage, rape culture on the campus, less security for gay and lesbian folk, transgender folk. What kind of nation, what kind of university do we have? Do we have a beloved community for the least of these? That's what King would say. And our job is to wrestle with those contradictions of black presidents and black misery, of freedom and unfreedom, safety and unsafety. And then right when we think we may have even turned a tiny corner, we get November 8th, 2016. I mean, it's a fascinating moment to think about. There's this way in which all these weird things have become normalized. Misogyny, patriarchy. Not to say that they didn't exist before, but to hear them normalized in such a kind of prominent way on TV and in the news. White mediocrity. I already got my check, so. I'm just saying, right? I mean, there's something fascinating about watching a Donald Trump. I mean, nobody destroys the notion of white supremacy more than Donald Trump. You watch Donald Trump, you're like, wait, way better than us. We're like, we good. There's a kind of way in which, juxtaposed to the Obama legacy, and I'm not an Obama guy, I'm just talking about in terms of representation. How this moment reminds us of what is unfinished. With the social contract, with the racial contract, with our representations. We have so much work to do. Dr. King would be challenging us to do that work. How, though? I think for me, the question is, how does Dr. King lead us into a more robust and more mature, a more sophisticated freedom dream? I think the first thing that King forces us to do is to release our imaginations. He challenges us to release our imaginations. When King is giving the I Have a Dream speech, and it's important to understand the context of the I Have a Dream speech, because he didn't give it the first time on August 28, 1963. He gave it another time before, and he has said those words before in a church, and he was wrestling with this idea of what his dream would be. But the fact that King framed his social vision in the context of a dream was his way of challenging us to not let the limits of the immediate, to not let the constraints of the moment define our reality. The great Howard Thurman, the theologian and mystic, said, never ever scale down your dreams to the level of that which is your immediate experience. What does it mean to not scale down your dream to the level of that which is your immediate experience? It means you don't become prisoner to the event. You don't become prisoner to the circumstance. Robert Kelly talks about the idea of the freedom dream. We must have a radical imagination that is grander than the moment. That means that as we enter this room, as we engage King, as we engage our political work, as we engage our pedagogical work, as we engage our intellectual work, we must at all moments think about freedom as unfinished and think about our freedom dreams as audacious. That means that we shouldn't be thinking about how to have warmer and fuzzier prisons. We should be thinking about how to create a world without prison. We have to create a world where the market doesn't define our reality. We can live in a world. People suggest that it's easier for people to imagine the end of the world itself than to imagine the end of capitalism. I'm challenging us to dream a more robust freedom dream. We don't have to be prisoner to the moment. We don't need to just put body cameras on cops. Let's think about how to demilitarize, disarm, and ultimately eliminate police from our communities. How can we reimagine the world in a grander freedom dream? So that our politics as usual, to quote the great Sean Carter, is one where we say government F government. We politic ourselves. How can we reimagine the world with a new freedom dream? We must release our imagination. Let's stop talking about what we can't do. That doesn't mean we're not pragmatic. It doesn't mean that we ignore the material conditions around us, but what it means is that we don't have to be prisoner to them. And then, as we engage our freedom dreams, now that they're released and grand and unfettered and unencumbered and audacious, we then have to think about something bigger. And the only way to engage in something bigger is to follow the legacy of King. King's legacy was one of deep listening. January 15th, 1968. King wakes up. Throws on his jeans, puts on a windbreaker jacket, he comes down the stairs. He sits with his children. They have breakfast. He listens to them. King understood the value of listening to young folk. Part of what it means to engage in a beloved community in the tradition of King is to understand the inherent value of young people. Too often we dismiss young folk as incomplete adults, as unfinished humanity, as folk who ain't right yet. As we said in the South, they ain't caught sense yet. But King understood that young folk are the energy behind any freedom struggle. Y'all, sometimes, particularly as college students, think of King as an older fella, kind of patriarch or father of civil rights. He dies at 39 years old. Malcolm dies at 39. Che dies at 39. I'm 38 and getting nervous. But think about not 39-year-old King. Think about 19-year-old King. Think about the King that graduated Morehouse at 16 years old. Then goes to Crozier, then goes to Boston for his Ph.D. Think about that King, not just his academic ambition or his intellectual capacity, but his youth. Think about Fred Hampton in Chicago. 19 years old when Chicago police killed him in his bed. Think about Huey and Bobby in Oakland. one a teenager, one in their early 20s, struggling for freedom. Think about young Claudette Colvin, who got shouted out earlier, the mother of civil rights. Before there was a Rosa Parks, there was a Claudette Colvin. If Rosa was the mother of civil rights, remember Claudette Colvin was not allowed to be the face of civil rights struggle because she was an unwed mother. She was a teenager and she didn't fit the respectability profile. If Rosa Parks is the mother of civil rights, Claudette is the baby mama of civil rights. And part of what we want to do is shatter that understanding of who and what people can be in order to struggle for freedom. That includes being young. Because young folk have always animated the struggle. They've always energized the struggle, but the challenge of doing that is to recognize the value in all young people, not just the ones we deem special. I'm on TV this morning debating this guy who gets pulled over and beaten by the police for standing up too straight and not hitting the ground fast enough when they hit him. And they say, well, he was a Ph.D. student. Cool. But I don't care if you're not a Ph.D. student. I shouldn't need a Ph.D. to not get killed. I shouldn't need a J.D. or a B.A. or an M.B.A. or an A.B.C.D.E.F.G. You shouldn't kill me because I'm a human being. But we have to be willing to see the humanity in these young folk. Because it's young folk that have been energizing us on the streets of Ferguson, and the streets of Baltimore, and the streets of New York, and the streets of Oakland. It's been young people that have kept us honest, and it's young people that have challenged us. Freedom struggles are only as strong as the young people behind them, but sometimes many of us who are becoming elders or who are elders would rather have the organization die with our arms around it than to give it to a young person who can take it over, who can be mentored, who can be taught, who can be led, who can be trained. We have to see that in all young people, but that means when you walk into your classrooms, when you walk into your neighborhoods, when you walk into your own house, you got to see the genius of your own babies. You can't presume that the genius will just pop out. You think Martin Luther King Jr.'s teacher knew she had Martin Luther King Jr. in her kindergarten class? I mean, can you imagine that she just saw this genius who would be a Nobel Prize winner, Nobel Peace Prize winner, this person who would be a world historical figure, what Sidney Hook would call an event-making man? No! She just saw another kid. Preacher's kid. Spoiled, middle class. You know how preacher's kids is. Talk kind of slow. I want to go to recess now. There was no reason to know that that would be Martin King. But the challenge of us is not to try and pick out or cherry pick the Martin King in each classroom. It's to look at all of our babies as if they have the ability to be Martin Luther King Jr., to look at all of our children as the next Ella Baker, or Fannie Lou Hamer, or Angela Davis, or Assata Shakur, or Claudette Colvin, or Pamela Africa. That's our challenge, to see those acres of diamonds in our own backyard, as Russell Conwell said, and to begin digging. So King left the breakfast table and went to Dexter Avenue Church. He had a small cake for him. They sang happy birthday. And he began the work of deep listening. King understood that listening is not merely a physical act. It's not merely a physiological process. It's not merely something that you do to hear what people got to say in the most literal of senses. He understood listening as a moral and ethical project. To listen to folk is to hear their story. It's to hear their narrative. It's to hear their side. It's to understand and recognize their humanity. To listen to folk deeply is not the same thing as to talk and I talk and you talk and we take turns while you talk and I'm just thinking about what I'm going to say next. That's not a conversation. That is not deep listening. King understood that we were only as good as our commitment to hearing the voices and the stories of others. So in the current moment, King would be asking us to do what he did on that day. King, after he had the breakfast and the cake, he met with sanitation workers. One of them had been mauled in Chicago. And he was trying to figure out what they could do about living wages, what they could do about workers' rights, what they could do about safer working conditions. He listened to them. He met with Chicano activists, figuring out, he was fascinated about what was happening both south of the border and immediately on the other side of the border, and he was interested in thickening the narrative and the representation in the face of the civil rights struggle. He understood that civil rights wasn't just a black thing. He understood that America was expanded, America was grown, America was matured, America was enhanced when civil rights were expanded. He met with Negro preachers, God bless them, trying to figure out how they could build on the gains of 1964 and 1965. He listened to them. He listened to them. He met with anti-war activists, trying to figure out how they could stop this thing in Vietnam. King understood that we were better when we weren't really locked into arms saying we should overcome, but also locked into circumstance. He understood that America responded differently to our misery when we were linked together in a multiracial coalition, in a multidimensional coalition, when our interests and our actions and our commitments and our politics were intersected. We had a more mature and a more robust social movement. King understood the value of deep listening. King understood the difference between John F. Kennedy walking through Harlem in 1960, holding up a black baby. Kennedy walking through Harlem in 1960, so he's trying to make Adam Clayton Powell happy. You know how those northern liberals are. They saw it as a cheap trick, a campaign stunt, kind of like a Bill Clinton going on Arsenio Hall in 92, playing the saxophone. Or Hillary and Selma in 08, in church, trying to clap more beat. She almost had it. It was dismissed as a campaign stunt that stood in sharp contrast to Bobby Kennedy walking through West Virginia, walking through Appalachia in 1963 with that white baby whose belly was bloated and snot's coming out of his nose. He's crying and he's hungry, and we begin our war on poverty. He understood that we had to whiten the face of poverty to make it real. Now, King's moral universe was more mature than that. King understood that the baby himself, whether he was in Boston or Berlin or Botswana or Birmingham, was all worth the same. All lives were connected in this garment of mutuality that King was talking about. He understood that, but he also understood the practical matter. To understand King is not to see him as a Negro preacher, but to see him as one of the great political strategists of the 20th century. You must understand King's complexity, but sometimes it's hard to understand King's complexity because we reduce black folk to the most basic understanding of who and what they are. We believe that black folk preach and white folk organize, that black folk bring experience and white folk bring theory, but there's something much more complicated about black folks' experience in this nation. We've always had something to teach America about itself. And that's what King is doing when he follows the tradition of deep listening. Think about the Black National Anthem, which we ain't sing today. What's the Black National Anthem? Lift every voice. You know, let's sing it. Stand up. I'll stand up for all kinds of other stuff. Y'all know it, right? Take out your phones, and y'all already snap it and Instagram it and Twitter. Google. Oh shit. I can't sing. Alright, we're gonna do this, alright? Give him 1 second. 1 second, Ray. You look like a Ray, Al. Google Black National Anthem. Lift every voice and sing. Alright, you ready? We're gonna do this. Oh, you're not Ray. One of the Raylets. Let's go, I love you. You ready? Wait, come on, y'all have to catch up. Y'all know the first verse. We can do all 3 verses, so y'all stop. Y'all ready? Lift every Y'all can do better than this. Sing a song. Face the rising sun. You should know this one too. But why should we sing it at every event? And how is it instructive for us? Lift every voice. Black folk, this song is created and put to music 4 years after it is written. At a moment where black folk were engaged, where the black codes and the slave codes were still prominent. This was still written where black folk couldn't eat in public, where black folk couldn't marry who they weren't, where they couldn't love who they weren't, where they couldn't attend schools, where they couldn't be full humans in public, where their voices were muted from the public ear. And yet black folk, when they made a freedom song, didn't say lift some voices. Black folk didn't say lift our voices. Black folk said lift every voice. Black folk had a more mature understanding of democracy than white folk who enslaved them. Black folk understood that America was only as good as everybody could be, as all of us could be included in a democratic contract. That's what made black folk lead this thing. We got out of slavery and joined military. We joined police forces. We got out of the slave thing and helped create and fortify the American empire that enslaved us. Black folk believed in America more than America believed in America. They don't know who they had on those ships. So, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Man, Lord. King understood that. King embraced that. King was part of a tradition of African people challenging America to listen to itself, to be its best self, to be its promised self, to be the self that was articulated on paper. That's why King is standing in front of Lincoln. King was saying, America, listen to yourself. He stood in front of the Lincoln statue, Lincoln Monument he's standing in front of on August 28, 1963. See, he was signifying. King wasn't just Baptist preacher, he was straight West Africa, Eshu Elegba, signifying trickster figure. King is up there like, oh, you saying we free in 1863, Mr. Lincoln? Well, I'm going to stand in front of you in 1963 at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. You said we're emancipated in 1863. Well, I'm going to stand here in 1963 as Martin King and say, fourscore year ago, a great American whose symbolic shadow we stand signed an Emancipation Proclamation. He was showing America that its work was unfinished, that Lincoln, you promised. See, that's what African folk have always done. David Walker's appeal, a preamble together with 4 articles to the colored citizens of the world, but particularly and most expressly those of the United States. He's having a book with a preamble and 4 articles. He's saying, you got this Constitution thing, America, but the Negro ain't free. Listen to yourself. Alon Equiano, the narrative of the life of Alon Equiano or Gustavus Vassa, written by himself. He talks about the Christian traitor, similar to what David Walker does before the Nat Turner Rebellion. And he's saying, wait a minute, America. You talking about these Christian love and Christian ethics, you got this Christianity that didn't keep track of your humanity, because the love ethic of Jesus, is Howard Thurman would say, isn't identified in the fact that Negroes are unfree, that women are unfree, that poor folk are unfree. America, your Christianity has lost track of your humanity. Listen to yourself. These Negro writers, Equiano, I wholly entreat your pardon for by himself, written by herself. Phyllis Wheatley, written by herself. They telling you that not because they thought that Negroes couldn't read, but because they thought Negroes couldn't read. And they were saying, America, listen to yourself. Y'all don't think we can write this stuff? David Hume, Kant, Jefferson, Notes on Virginia. Yeah, y'all don't think Negroes have the capacity for intellection. Ain't that what Jefferson said in Notes on Virginia? Yeah, Thomas Jefferson had a complicated relationship to Negroes. He ain't love Negroes, but he... It's a fascinating thing, right? Negroes can't learn to read and write, but let's make laws to stop them from learning how to read and write. Negroes are lazy, let's make them slaves. Negroes are dirty, they'll clean their houses. Negroes are uncivilized, but they raised our children. Listen to yourself. So, King is saying, America, listen to yourself. You promised. We think of the I Have a Dream speech. You can't have King Day without playing the I Have a Dream speech. We play like 4 lines of it. We want to hear about little black boys and black girls at the table of brotherhood. We want to hear about living in a world where people aren't judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That becomes our only vision of King's dream. King's dream was not just about some multicultural kitchen table. King's dream wasn't to look like a Pharrell video. King's vision was a robust social imagination where America kept track of its promises. The I Have a Dream speech wasn't about dreams. Dreams don't have budgets to them. King's dream was about the broken promise. King's speech was about the broken promise. He was saying, 80 years ago, great America, whose symbolic shadow we stand sign an Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree was what? A great beacon light. He was saying that the proclamation gave us hope. He said, but the Negro remains what? Unfree. He says, I come to the nation's capital to what? Cash a check. King wasn't here begging, hat in hand. King was demanding what was ours. King was saying, America, you promised. He said, the Negroes in a vast island of poverty amidst an ocean of material wealth and prosperity. King was saying, America, you promised. King said that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Emancipation Proclamation were promissory notes. He said they were like checks. But students, y'all understand this. He said the Negro's check has been returned what? Insufficient funds. He said, I refuse to believe the great vaults of democracy could be empty. King was saying, America, you promised. The legacy of King was not one of America begging America rather to be integrated and diverse and colorful. We didn't think our IQs would go up if white people were in our schools. We thought books would be there. We didn't just want white folk around for its own sake. We did not want white folk around, but that wasn't the point. The point of King's legacy was for us to be made whole. Because America, you promised. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, King said, America, you promised. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, America, you tried to promise. It's a broken promise, but you tried. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, America, you promised. 1955, Brown v. Board 2. All deliberate speed, America, you promise. 1964, Public Accommodations, America, you promise. 1965, Voting Rights Act, America, you promise. The legacy of King is to get America to keep track of its promises so that we can finally live in a nation that is as good as its promise. But King understood that listening project required us to connect across coalition. But let me say 2 more things and I'm gonna leave y'all alone. He said, King also challenged us to ask different questions. King challenged us to ask different questions. King wasn't satisfied saying, we want to integrate lunch counters. King wasn't satisfied begging for jobs. King wasn't satisfied. Trying to integrate a few white universities. King had a grander vision because he asked different questions. And King asked different questions because King engaged ideas. King read deeply. College students, if we're going to be freedom fighters, grown folk, if we're going to be freedom fighters, we have to engage ideas. Go to Stanford, read the King papers. King was reading deeply in the 50s and 60s and in the 40s. King read different traditions and different ideas and different philosophies. This idea that I only read stuff that I agree with, I only follow people on Twitter that think what I think, I only watch the cable news network where the host is going to say something that I already said to my people at work earlier today at the water cooler. We got to engage broader ideas. Jesse Jackson used to tell me, he said, first day everybody can preach with Dr. King. We go to revival, first week everybody. First night everybody preach with King. Negro preachers bring their best stuff the first night. He said about second, third night, King's Ph.D. would kick in. He said King he knew the Greek mythology. He understood philosophy. He understood rich theological concepts. He was reading social theory. King read widely and deeply. I love social media, family, but we can't reduce our information intake to 140 characters. We got to engage more deeply. King did that, but King asked different questions. King didn't just ask why the Negro was being beaten. King was asking what's the relationship between the Negro being beaten and struggling for freedom and someone struggling for freedom in Accra, Ghana. What is the relationship between poverty in the United States, in the South, and expanding industrialism in the North? King was asking rich and complex questions about the relationship between things. What's the relationship between militarism and poverty and racism? How do we intersect these things? Let's ask different questions. The current moment likes to reduce things to simple answers when the questions are complex. And when you watch cable news, I'm on CNN, Don Lemon will say to me, and I love Don, it's the homie, he'd be like, Mark, I want you to explain, you got a long segment, it's 4 minutes. I want you to explain why people are poor. And then we have to reduce our understanding of poverty to 4 minutes. Fox will give you less than that. Don't take long, right, black people? So we have to have a more complicated conversation. We have to ask more rich and complex questions about the world. That's what King would do. King wouldn't just say, why are people poor, and reduce it to poor people's choices. King would say, what are the forces and conditions that allow poverty to exist? What are the conditions that make people poor even when they work hard? Because the problem is we tend to reduce everything to the most simple and extreme case, right? We all know somebody trifling. You all got that sister that live in the house and won't move out. Right. We all got that person during the housing crisis. People said, oh my God, Negroes are buying more house than they can afford. These Latinos are getting more house than they can afford. They don't have jobs and they're getting no doc mortgages. Yes, there are like 10 people that got made $20,000 a year working at Zaxby's and decided that they was gonna buy a $500,000 house. Yes, there are people like that. We all know somebody trifling. You all know somebody that has $20,000 rims, don't even got a car, right? We all know people like this, but that's a simple answer to a complicated question about multinational corporations being deregulated, about access to capital being increased for those who are already wealthy and decreased for those who are not. It's about predatory lending. It's about corporations betting against their own. And it's about government bailouts of the most powerful at the expense of the most vulnerable. There's a conversation to be had, and that's the conversation King would have. King wouldn't just say that people are locked up because they're trifling or because they're lazy or because we raised a generation of criminals. There were 280,000 people incarcerated when King dies. There are now 2.5 million people in cages around America. We did not raise a generation of criminals. We did not raise a generation of people who are ethically corrupt or engaged in acts of moral turpitude. We didn't raise a generation of slow runners. Folk don't get away from police like they used to. It's a different analysis. It's not a generation of criminals, it's a generation of criminalization. You in a mental institution, we take the money away from a mental institution and put you on the street. Then we make it illegal to be on the street through these state laws. And so now people who are in mental institutions are now in jail. We have you on drugs and medicalized treatment in mental facilities. You're now on the street and you self-medicate. And at the same time that you self-medicate, and then you pour what hits the streets in '84, crack. So now you got the synthetic cheap drug that you use to self-medicate because you don't have the structural resources anymore. And then we prosecute a war on drugs that didn't work because drugs are cheaper, easier to get, and stronger than ever. And then you end up in jail for that. And then you end up homeless, and the homeless get hidden and erased through mental institutions, or rather through prison, and so we have a transcarceral state. In other words, you was in a place for support and care, and now you're in a place of containment and blame. And then you get into prison and there's no resources, there's no mental health support, there's no education. We take away loans, we take away grants, you're subject to sexual trauma. And then you get out and you can't get a job, you can't vote, you can't get public housing, and you can't get education. This is a system. But if you just look at the analysis of people being in prison, what are all the things that get you there? You're not honoring the legacy of King. The legacy of King is to discern wisely. It's to ask different questions. One more thing. I believe the legacy of King is largely also committed to brave action. To brave action. King was one of the most courageous freedom fighters we've ever seen. Why? Because King was willing to act bravely. What does it mean to act bravely? For King, it was a commitment to the project of nonviolence. We can reduce or dismiss nonviolence to pacifism and simplistic cowardice even. But there's nothing more courageous than nonviolence. Now don't get me wrong, that ain't the only game in town, that ain't my thing. I believe in nonviolence as a tactic, not as an overarching philosophy. However, King's commitment to nonviolence was stunning. This moral idea that nonviolence may not stop you from hating me, but it may stop me from hating you. And that matters. King's vision of brave action was one of international connection, national and international connection. We organize locally, but we engage in mass action. If dogs bite us in Birmingham, we bleed everywhere. As King grew in his own analysis, King understood even more the significance of internationalization. King understood even more the value of connecting across borders. King understood that there was no way to talk about the Negro in Birmingham without talking about the Negro and the African in Accra, Ghana. Struggling for freedom in apartheid South Africa, or struggling for liberation in Sudan. He understood the connection. What does that mean for us? For us, it means that we must engage in brave action. To act bravely means you gotta do something really important, y'all. You gotta act. You gotta do something. If you don't remember anything else I told y'all tonight, remember this. The biggest problem in the world today is that there are too many people who don't do anything. Everybody can't lead a march. People are constrained by their economic condition. They're constrained by their family situations. They're constrained by their ability status. I don't want to be narrow or elitist or ableist in how I understand what engagement looks like, but everybody can do something. I'm not against hashtag activism. I'm not against online activism. It shouldn't be the only thing we do, but it can be a component of what we do. I'm not against cultural politics. I'm not against making music or wearing a jacket or having a hashtag or wearing a hairstyle that serves as a force of resistance. It ain't the only thing we should be doing, but everybody can do something. But the biggest problem is that so many of us fail to respond to anything. Elections get stolen. Children get killed. Unsafety prevails in our immediate community. Hunger is around us. Homelessness is around us. And too many of us don't do anything. To act bravely is to join an organization. We need organized action. King represented a model of organized action. It ain't the only model of organized action, but it is important to join an organization. I didn't say start an organization. I said, what? Join an organization. Everybody, I go to college campuses all the time, everybody want to start an organization. There'd be 50 black people on campus and 25 organizations. Everybody president and vice president. The legacy of King can seduce you and confuse you into thinking that the model of organized action is the charismatic, cisgendered, hetero male in front. But the model of leadership that we have to understand is one of organized action with many people, that is diverse, that is multicultural, that is multi-gendered, that has different gender performances, that different ethnic backgrounds, different religious and non-religious orientations. We need a complicated social movement made up of people who are willing to act and organize even if they don't get a microphone. Even if they don't get put in charge of something, even if they don't get their way. We must continue to organize and struggle together in movements, even when you're not in charge, because if you only join the organization when you're in charge, or when you get your name in the paper, or you get the byline, or you get on CNN, then the movement is not being advantaged. You are. That ain't about the movement, that's about you. And the legacy of King, as King said in 68, the legacy of King is one of what? Dangerous unselfishness. Dangerous unselfishness. That means that you must join and commit to the organization even when you don't get your way, but there's a long history of us not doing that. Go to any black neighborhood in America, you see Second Baptist Church. You know why there's Second Baptist Church? It was just Baptist Church before. And then folks fall out. Folks disagree. Folks don't get their part in the choir. Folks don't make the deaconess board. Folks get told their chicken tastes nasty. Next thing you know, Second Baptist Church. Some cities, Third Baptist. We need a new model of leadership. The King model shows us what inspired and dangerous unselfishness looks like, but we can also correct the model and say that we don't need another generation of movements only led by men. We don't need another generation of movements only led by heterosexual people. We don't need another movement only led by cisgender people. We don't need another generation of movements that only exist in the church. We need a range of movements and actions that lead people where we want to go. To act bravely is to commit to that kind of organization. To act bravely is to make your organizations do what they're supposed to do. King looked at his Baptist convention and said, family, we're not doing what we're supposed to do. If we're honoring the spirit of Jesus Christ, we got to honor the spirit of a revolutionary Jesus Christ. We got to honor the spirit of a radical Palestinian Jew that overturned tables. They got rid of money changers that was committed to changing the world. to preach good news to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to free the captive. King was saying we have to make this organization do what it's supposed to do. So many of you on college campuses, I'm asking you to make your organization do what it's supposed to do. You a young Democrat. Small d. What kind of Democrat do you want to be? Do you want to be a neoliberal Democrat? Do you want to worship the market? Do you want to be dragged so far to the center that anything left of Donald Trump looks radical? Or do you want to be a true Democrat that believes in a social safety net, that believes that we have to protect the vulnerable, that believes we have to free the captive, that believes we have to invest in people again? What kind of Democrat do you want to be? Y'all have campus NAACP? Right. What kind of NAACP you want to be? You want to be a happy to be in the room NAACP? An NAACP that'll just show up to Trump Tower smiling? I had a meeting with the president. Are you an NAACP that just wants to build wealth and privatize everything? Do you want to be nothing but an extension of a Democratic Party that has exploited you? Or do you want to be a W.E.B. Du Bois NAACP? Do you want to be an Ida B. Wells Barnett NAACP? Do you want to stop the lynchings that happen every day? Do you want to expand democracy every day? Do you want to free the captive every day? What kind of NAACP do you want to be? Y'all got black Greeks on campus. But what kind of black Greeks y'all want to be? Do y'all want to be happy to be in the room? Black Greeks? Do you want to be purely focused on strolling, ape walking, barking? Do you only want to focus on what you did to get into the organization? Or do you want to focus on what you do once you get into the organization? Because there's a difference in our tradition. What did your founders want you to do? Did they want you to just get in? I ain't saying skate, I'm saying once you get in, what you gonna do? Can you imagine walking through college bragging about your high school essay? Yo, I worked on this joint for 8 weeks, 5 days, 22 minutes, and 50 seconds. And you fail in all your classes. Walk around talking about you good. And you're good for nothing. Who do you want to be? If you're going to build on campus, build something. If you got a line full of Q's, give them some tutors, teach them how to read, and then have them teach the kids how to read. Oftentimes, African-American children don't get exposed to the arts. They don't get exposed to recreational sports. They don't get exposed to things like ice skating. Get a group of alphas. Nobody knows how to skate like alphas. Get them there. I had an iota joke, but what's the point, right? It's like 3 of them. 2 of their founders are over there. They're graduating this year. Where was I? Dr. King. Dr. King, Dr. King, Dr. King. Family, if we are going to engage in brave action, we have to be committed to fearlessness. King was a truth teller even when it was difficult. If we're going to engage in brave action, King wasn't just brave in 63 when he told folk to not fight back. He was brave in 68 when he fought against the American war machine. Malcolm wasn't just brave in 1964 when he's talking tough. He's also brave when he's trying to bring America into the International Court for Human Rights Abuses. There is a way in which our bravery has to extend beyond the local, and it certainly has to extend beyond our narrow partisan politics. Some of y'all was marching with me in 2004 against Bush's drones, and when Obama started shooting drones to Yemen and Somalia, y'all ain't said nothing yet. If you're going to be courageous at all times. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said what? He said, "Qul al-haq wa in kana mar," and speak the truth, though it may be bitter. And we are in a bitter moment. We need bravery at all turns. I need you to speak out, not just when it's convenient, but when it is not. If you living in occupied Palestine, if you living in the largest open-air prison in the world in Gaza, if you in the occupied West Bank, if your homes are being destroyed in the settlements in the 48 territories, if you're not having access to fresh drinking water in the 67 territories, if you're being blocked in Rafah, you don't care whether it's Bush or Trump or Obama or Clinton or Carter. We can't afford to be purely partisan. We must operate on principle. I know y'all tired. I'm ready to go. I'm gonna leave y'all alone. But principle renders you in this space of king what I like to call radical solitude. King often felt alone. King often felt alone. 1968, King wasn't Times Man of the Year anymore like he was in 63. In 1968, King couldn't make People magazine's Most Admired Americans lists. In 1968, King couldn't get American Program Bureau couldn't book Martin Luther King Jr. Schools wouldn't have him on campus. King was stabbed before he was shot, years before he was shot, by a black person. All you skin folk ain't your kinfolk. King, Morehouse College wouldn't let Martin Luther King Jr. on the board of trustees. They said King was a bad influence on young people. Said he went to jail too much. See, history will always redeem you because history is written backwards. Life is lived forward. You have to live without consideration of what it means to be liked. Because if you go all around this world and everybody like you, something probably wrong with you. If everybody like you, you probably not struggling for freedom. If everybody like you, you probably ain't got no principle. If everybody like you, you probably not happy deep inside. If everybody like you, you ain't operating right. If everybody like you, the world ain't getting better. Those of us who operate in the tradition of King understand that there will be moments where you'll be hated and despised, but you ain't worried about that because you know something bigger is coming up behind you. If you are understanding the legacy of King, you don't worry about being alone because you know that the struggle for freedom is to be alone. So you're on college campuses right now and you feel alone. You come to college and you read your books, you read your theory, you learn about these complicated ideas, and after you read them, you go back to the hood and you go back to your family, and people are like, oh, you think you're smart because you went to college and read a couple of books, and it makes you feel alone. You're on your college campus and you're struggling to organize your friends, and when you have a step show, especially when the Newz is out, when you have a step show, 5,000 people show up. When you have an informational or educational session, only 5 people show up. I know you feel alone. When it's time to come to the party, everybody wants to be here. When it's time to organize a movement, nobody shows up. I know you feel alone. You got friends that are liberal, and they love liberal issues, and they liberal on every issue but Israel. I know you feel alone. I ain't scared of y'all. You got people who are radical on the question of race, but when gender comes up, Suddenly everybody turned into Hotep Harry. I know you feel alone. There are moments where you talking about gender and race, but sexuality and transgender identity somehow complicates the conversation, and everybody runs and they act like, oh, I can't deal with a transgender bathroom. Negro, you had a transgender bathroom in your grandmama's house. It wasn't male, it wasn't female, it was just a bathroom. Grow up. I know you feel alone. Some of y'all work with white folk, good white folk. They love black people till it's time to hire one. I know you feel alone. But that's what this tradition is about. Harriet Tubman was alone. Black women been leading Negroes to freedom for hundreds of years, and they've always been alone. Martin stood on that stage, but when Martin couldn't find his groove, it was Mahalia that stood there on August 28, 1963, and said, Martin, tell him about the dream. I know you felt alone. Harriet Tubman had to lead folk to freedom. That's where y'all at right now. Follow the tradition, not just of Martin, but of Harriet. Leading Negroes to freedom even when you feel alone, especially when you feel alone. Because there are moments when you got to round up the people and tell them that it's time to go. Negroes singing, glory gonna come in the morning. Steal away to Jesus. They wasn't just gospel songs. They was telling Negroes tomorrow morning be by the tree. We out. And Harriet had to round up all these Negroes and not just get them out, but convince them to leave. She said, I freed hundreds of black people. She said, I could have freed hundreds more if only they would have known they were slaves. It is your job right now when you're feeling alone to convince the people around you. And I'm not just talking to black folk. White folk, you got to stake in this too, because we can't get free till everybody get free. You got to let go of white supremacy. You got to let go of white privilege. We got to let go of patriarchy. We got to let go of heterosexism. We got to let go of cisgender norms. We got to let go of class arrogance. We got to let go of a lot of stuff. But when you're doing that work, you got to convince people that something is better than what they got right here. That democracy is unfinished. Obama made you feel good, we can do better. Trump makes you feel whatever, we damn sure can do better. The world can be better. You got to convince them to be by that tree and to start moving through the woods for freedom. And when you convince them to move through the woods for freedom, people get scared. They start moving through the woods and they say, I want to go back. Home was safe. Home was comfortable. I knew what home looked like. I don't know what the future is going to look like. Negroes get afraid when you start talking about a world without prisons. When you start talking about ending the occupation of Palestine. When you start talking about ending militarism. When you start talking about ending Islamophobia. Negroes get scared as they walk into the woods to freedom and they want to turn back. And that's when Harriet got the shotgun. This little black woman would convince them and cajole them and inspire them to freedom. And when them 6'5" Negroes got scared, she knocked them on the head and dragged them to freedom. They woke up in Massachusetts, where am I? Nigga, you're free.
Shit on kids who get it their own way and won't tell them the first president's own slaves. You ever look for out and there's no way, like Diddy first album, so you had to sell cocaine? I ain't do it, but got people that did. What would you do if ain't no meat in your ribs? No place to stay, you say that you wouldn't, it's easy to fit. When you in trouble and your privilege get you easier bids, you pleading the fifth. I'm a rider, of course, I'm from where having parents to give you survival remorse.